Part 1. 1. "If you keep harassing the ladies, I'm going to make a big pot of mutton curry out of you," Fiona said, glaring at the big Saanen ram who was poised for another charge. Ramses was an enormous and rascally creature, a creamy white color with an impressive long beard dangling from his chin. Over 200 pounds, he used his weight to his advantage. He was, in a word, a bully, and Fiona Scarborough had had just about enough of him. She was currently squatting in a corner of the paddock fence, a box of tools beside her, but she didn't dare take her eyes off the goat. The goat paddock was a crude affair, made with her own hands, but a particularly fierce wind, bitterly cold, had swept through early in the morning and pulled 3 boards off. The crossbeam was still intact, so nailing them back in place should have been an easy job. All she needed to do was drive a few nails in. But she didn't dare turn her back on the bully. Indeed, at that very moment, Ramses had his big yellow eyes fixed on her, and he kept raising and lowering his head as if daring her to look away. "Okay, if you want to pick on me, that's fine," Fiona said, waving her hammer at him. "Just leave the ladies alone. Better yet, don't bother anyone." The female milking goats were mostly clustered together in the far corner, protecting each other from the unpredictable male. Ramses finally turned away and wandered off, snorting and shaking his head, as if he'd grown bored of Fiona. "Now's my chance," she thought, pulling a nail out of the front pocket of her overalls. She leaned one of the fallen boards back in place, but she pressed it against the crossbeam now and set the tip of the nail in place. And then she heard it. The clank and clack of goat horns banging together. With a sigh, she lowered the nail and looked over her shoulder. Ramses had made his way to the ladies in the corner, and he was currently locking horns with Delilah, the oldest of the females. She didn't really want to engage with him and kept trying to back away, but the other goats were in the way. Finally, Ramses backed up, lowered his head, and butted her. Fiona tossed the hammer down, rose, and went to him. As she approached, he gave her an ornery look over his shoulder, as if daring her to get in the way. "Leave the ladies alone, I said!" Fiona grabbed his collar and pulled him away. "Just stand in your corner and behave!" She walked him toward the feed trough, where a small bit of food remained. "See? Clean your plate," she said, petting him on the neck. He bent down, as if to do just that, and Fiona went back to her corner. Still, she could hear him banging the edge of the trough with his horns. He was definitely in a mood, worse than usual, and the timing was especially annoying. As Fiona returned to the broken section of the paddock, another blast of cold air swept through the paddock and knocked the loose boards over. It pulled some of Fiona's long auburn hair out of her loose ponytail, and she angrily swept it back into place as she knelt beside the broken fence. The paddock was in almost constant need of repairs, like the rest of her homestead, which kept her busy most days. With 15 acres of old buildings that she'd patched numerous times, she was proud of what she'd achieved. She had a home, a barn, a garage, a workshop, a small greenhouse, and additional storage buildings, and somehow she'd kept them all together. She set one of the fallen boards back in place, securing it with a few nails. By the time she picked up the second board, the chill began to bite the exposed skin of her face. Ramses had ceased messing with the trough and was tromping about again, looking for trouble. Soon enough, he was back in the corner, messing with the milking goats. Fiona finished nailing the second board in place before turning to him. She'd been thinking about butchering him for a while now, though at his size it would be a lot of meat to deal with. Still, she wondered if he was more trouble than he was worth. Technically, he was a cart puller, but he hadn't pulled a cart in years. He locked horns with one of the females. "Ramses, get away from there, you creep!" she shouted, reaching for the third and final board. "They don't like you!" Ramses bleated. "Yeah, I know you heard me," Fiona said, positioning a nail. She had just started to swing the hammer when she heard him coming. Hooves clawing the ground. With less than a second to react, she tried to rise, but Ramses slammed into her. He drove his curled horns into her back and shoved her against the fence, instantly knocking the wind out of her. She fell to one side, sprawling on the ground as she dropped the hammer and nail in the process. She rolled onto her side and planted her hand against the ground, but Ramses was already backing up, lowering his head for a second charge. Though she tried to pick herself up, she could tell she wasn't going to make it. This time Ramses would hit her in the side, and she was already struggling to catch her breath. "Mutton curry," she managed to say. And then she heard sharp, furious barking as Smoke came racing toward the paddock. Smoke was an Australian cattle dog, his fur mostly black with flecks of white. A stocky dog, he had boundless energy. Fiona couldn't keep him contained. Indeed, she let him run wild around the 15-acre property while she worked on the paddock. But apparently he'd finally sensed Ramses's orneriness. The dog leapt over the low paddock fence. Ramses paused mid-charge and hastily backed away as Smoke proceeded to herd him into a corner all by himself, dashing from side to side to cut off any escape. With a groan, Fiona picked herself up, using the fence for support. She could feel a big spot on her lower back that would no doubt turn into a giant bruise in another day or two. Satisfied, Smoke finally padded over to her side, and she petted his head. Ramses stayed in his corner for the time being, clearly intimidated. "Thanks. Good boy," Fiona said. She bent down to retrieve the hammer and felt a twinge of pain. It was enough to turn annoyance into full-blown anger. She tossed the hammer into the toolbox, then kicked the side of the toolbox for good measure. Smoke was giving her an eager look, and she scratched him behind the ears. "I sure wish you had opposable thumbs," she said. "I could really use the help. You have no idea." She made her way over to Ramses and grabbed his collar, dragging him out of the corner. He came only reluctantly, keeping his eyes on Smoke, who circled around behind him. She led the goat across the paddock and into the side door on the barn. "I've had quite enough of you for one day," she muttered, pulling him toward one of the box stalls inside the dim, dusty building. She got him into the stall and closed and latched the gate. As she backed away, Ramses strode toward the gate and gave her his weird-eyed look, as if to say, "What did I do?" Yes, there were moments when Fiona found herself close to despair. It didn't take much, really. Getting head-butted by Ramses was quite enough. She'd worked so hard, day after day, for so long, yet it felt like she was just barely keeping the homestead together. Smoke was a great dog and a good companion, but it wasn't the same as having other people around. "I don't want other people around," she reminded herself. "I don't need them." As she made her way back out of the barn, she stuck her hands under the front flap of her overalls. She was wearing leather work gloves, but they weren't made for warmth. Already her fingers ached from the cold. Still, she made her way back to the fence and forced herself to finish the repairs, even as the cold sank deeper and deeper into her flesh. When the final board was in place, she shut and latched the toolbox. Then she took her gloves off and vigorously rubbed her hands together. When that didn't help, she cupped her hands around her mouth and blew on them. Through all of this, Smoke kept watch, as if he thought Ramses might somehow sneak up behind them. "God, I hate the cold so much," she thought, grabbing the handle of the big toolbox and picking it up. "What is the deal with this awful weather? It's not even close to winter yet." She had just stood up again when she saw the first snowflakes falling. They were fat and heavy, falling from a pure white sky. It shocked her. She looked out beyond the gate and saw her house sitting on its low hilltop, with the tall trees at the edge of the property providing a dark green backdrop. She had created a path of crude steps leading from the barn to the porch, which made for easy passage as she began her early morning chores. Now she was envisioning it all covered in snow. "It's September," she muttered. "How can it already be snowing?" No sense thinking about it now. If she'd learned anything during her time on the homestead, it was to deal first with the known before worrying about the unknown. This was the only way to keep from being overwhelmed. As she started toward the house, lugging the toolbox with her, Smoke pawed at her side. She bent to scratch his ears. "We'll be okay, boy," she said. "We made it this far, didn't we? No matter what the season throws at us, we'll deal with it. You and me." Smoke barked, ran a circle around her, and headed up the hill.